Lou Perez here with We the Internet TV for our second, #2 live stream. And as you can see, it's a Halloween special. I am so excited. We're going to be talking about trick-or-treating, cultural appropriation, hate speech, all the things that you guys like. And we're all here. And I am so happy with the panel that we got. To my right, we have Lenore Skenazy.
Hi.
She is the founder of Free Range Kids. And to her right, my good friend Boris Khaykin. Over there, he's a comedian, writer, producer, editor, master of many trades. To my left, we have Alex Estrada, comedian, writer, producer, located in New York. And over to his left, we have Brendan O'Neill, who is the editor at Spiked. It's an online magazine. Definitely check it out. And as you can see, nobody else dressed up in a costume. And that's cool. People don't have to listen to memos. That's all right. No problem. But it being a Halloween special, one of the first things I wanted to talk about is over the years, kids.
Yeah. We've been doing this show
Tell us,
for a
Dad.
while.
We've been doing this show. This is our 10th year doing this. So I always see these articles about cultural appropriation, you know, and it's weird for me seeing them around Halloween because for me, Halloween seems like a time where you're supposed to like let loose, be a little mischievous, be a sexy werewolf if you want. But then you start, seeing articles and also a tweet like this. Hey guys, can you bring up the tweet? This one comes from Kirsten Powers, and Kirsten wrote, "Dear white people who are upset that you can't dress up as another race or culture for Halloween, your feelings don't matter. The only feelings that matter are those who feel disrespected/mocked by you, appropriating their culture for entertainment. Show some common decency." I'm obviously a little biased on that. We made a video called "The Problem with Bumblebee Man," which was a parody of the problem with a poo. But Alex, since you're the second Latino that we have,
Oh, great.
You're the only Latino we'll allow on this stage aside from
And
me.
for good reason.
And for good reason, right? I don't need the competition, man. I'm competing with white people. I don't need.
Man.
No, but what do you think of?
Well, I think when it comes to this kind of thing, we talk about appropriation. What people are really get upset about are things like exploitation. When folks feel that aspects of their culture, certain customs are being taken and used in a way that denigrates their meaning or their importance. Like a good example would be something like, did you ever see? You guys remember Outkast? You remember the old band there? Well, so they did a Grammy performance once where during their dance, the dance part of it, they had dancers that dressed up as Native Americans with like headdresses and tomahawks and like that kind of thing. And there was at the time there was a massive backlash to it. People were like, "How dare you? This is racist. It mocks Native Americans." And I think their response was something along the lines of like, "Well, no, it's not like this wasn't necessarily like a spiritual act or something that was taken and used in a way that like they never would use it. It was frequently they wore these things or did these things like during dances." It's not being done in a way that denigrates or exploits anybody. And so in terms of, what was the letter again? It said dear white people.
Yeah, dear white people.
It's a great way to start a conversation.
Yeah, it's always wonderful. Yeah, I always love it when a letter starts "Dear white people."
Dear white.
Which is,
In a way,
Yeah.
I used to love Outkast, especially in college. If I was a part of a culture, I'm like, could they do my culture?
Do me next.
Yeah, just like make it way cooler.
It's almost like you're at like a Rodney Dangerfield show or something, and he starts making fun of somebody, and people get excited about rip on me. What about my wife?
The Don Rickles.
Don Rickles.
Yeah, and to make this personal, an example that's often thrown around is something like Cinco de Mayo. And the thing is, like, for a lot, it is important to a lot of people of Mexican heritage. It's considered it isn't even really a national holiday in Mexico. I think it might be a federal holiday, but it's not like a big deal. Mm-hmm. And to Mexicans in the United States, it's the same way. Like, my family didn't really celebrate it. Our extended family didn't really celebrate it. It's not necessarily a big part of our culture. And so, but regardless, even when it comes around, like there's still people who come out and say like, "Oh, how dare you!"
It's a great opportunity to get angry.
It's a great exactly, and I think people are more excited about that than the actual customs themselves.
Brenda, what do you?
Yeah.
I think the cultural appropriation thing is crazy. All culture is appropriated. That's the whole nature of culture. You can't make culture without mixing things, sharing things, borrowing from here, borrowing from there. I mean, pop culture is entirely cultural appropriation. Rock and roll comes from mixing of whites in the south of America taken from blacks. Hip hop borrowed in the early days from European electro music. Western cinema, Hollywood, borrows a lot from East Asian blockbuster movies. Everything is about mixing things together.
Right.
Even high culture. Shakespeare and Chaucer appropriated all their stories from other people and just rewrote them in a better way. So I think there are two things I think about cultural appropriation. The first thing is, if we were to take it really seriously and to say you can't borrow, you can't mix, culture would come to an end. Culture would just be impossible without that sharing. And then the second thing I think is that actually it's really dangerous in terms of the race discussion, because I think it regiments people in a racial way. And the argument is really that you've got to stay in your lane. This is the favourite phrase of the PC set these days. Stay in your lane. You stick with your culture, I'll stick with mine. It's really a cry for cultural purity, which to me sounds pretty far right. And so I don't like the way it makes the mixing of cultures impossible when that's such an exciting thing, and the way it really says to everyone, you are a particular race, stay as that race, and don't try and do anything else. I think that's an ugly argument.
Yeah, non-Italians should not use indoor plumbing. I'm going to say it. The Romans came up with it. You got to give it. We're giving it back.
It's also interesting, like, who ends up being the most vocally mad about it too, because I forget what the example was specifically, but I think I don't know if it was like Katy Perry or someone had appropriated Japanese culture, and then they actually went to Japan, and the Japanese were like, yeah, this is awesome. Like, this is great.
I think Gwen Stefani, the Harajuku, she was accused of that, but it's like, no, but like the way that she did it, like honored, like this is a style, this is a like a cultural thing that they're honoring and using in the way it was meant to. It's like when people get upset that when white people open a Mexican restaurant and they're like, oh, how dare you? This isn't your food. It's just like it was made to be eaten.
Right.
Like that's the most important thing.
And also, like there's a really strong case to be made that even what we know as Mexican food in the U.S. is American because of the way.
Oh yeah, there are
that things have
Texan
changed.
influences.
Yeah, depending on where you.
Right,
Yeah.
pizza. The pizza we got here is our pizza. Russian food, where I'm from, is like half of it stolen from somewhere. I grew up thinking like, oh, I love Russian food.
Literally stolen from the Eastern Bloc.
Like literally jacked it and brought it to our dinner table from somewhere.
Yeah.
No, but like stuff that I grew up thinking it's like this is culturally Russian food. So much of it I later learned was like, oh, this recipe comes from the French. This recipe comes from wherever.
Yeah,
And
they venerated the French.
There's a
And
lot
it's
of
good.
cross-pollination. There you go. Like how I did that?
I think the big thing is like, yes, some of the louder, angrier people just want to erase the nuance from the conversation. Because like you said, the term can be confusing, and if people start like really sticking to the term, the part that people have a problem with, right, is either exploitation or just somebody being an asshole. Like somebody can, you have the idea of like a white guy dressing like a Mexican, let's say, at like a college party. And there's some difference between that guy just getting drunk and thinking that this is a funny outfit.
And he's just dressed as a Dodgers fan. Like that's
I don't know anything about baseball. I don't know.
I lived in LA for like 4 years.
Okay.
It's a look.
Yeah.
It's a look.
But I can also see two different people doing that same exact thing, and one of which being like a racist jerk who like wants to mock somebody, and the other one just being like, oh, I'm gonna get a funny hat and not think too much about my outfit. And you know what? People say right now, like, white people can't wear a sombrero. I went to Mexico earlier this year. A lot of Mexican people wanted to sell me a sombrero. I'm like, I'm sorry, I'm not allowed by the other white people to give you money and help your industry. Like, what is
So
that?
much of the Mexican economy is, reliant on
cultural
cultural appropriation that you're basically saying to them, like, no, you're gonna have to eat dirt or something like
But
that.
that's part of it, is that, like, if you have a restaurant that's trying to make this food, you have whatever, like, eventually you need to do that in order for, like, everybody to flourish in various ways. Like, we have to borrow from each other, we have to sell stuff to each other and create new stuff and grow by learning from each other.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think the good things in life belong to everybody. Like that should be sort of the attitude. If it's if it's music, if it's food or anything like that, if it enriches someone's life, I think it can potentially enrich other people's. Like they shouldn't feel bad about using it.
Right.
Yeah.
It also just gets straight up confusing because it's not a fully thought out philosophy in general. So like it's very easy. I think I was telling you that I had a bit about this where like when the white supremacists in the South had the tiki torches and everybody was like and everybody was mad at them and they were like I had friends who were doing sketches about it and they were like, yeah, I felt like weird carrying a tiki torch on the train because everybody's gonna think I'm a white supremacist. But like those are Polynesian. So like but they just because they were bad enough, nobody's accusing them of cultural appropriation anymore. They're like, those are yours now. Like the Nazis appropriated the swastika, but most people don't really like care that much. If they see you with the swastika, they're not gonna be like, is that the original? Or are you culturally appropriating? Or which is worse? Do I be mad at you for culturally appropriating the Indian one or for being a Nazi?
But a lot of that, a lot of the white, because it's always white people really who get most mad about this. It's not Japanese people who weren't worried about Katy Perry or whoever dressing as a geisha. It's not Mexicans. It's well-educated, politically correct,
Non-working class.
non-working class,
Well-meaning.
absolutely non-working class white people.
That's
and,
bad. Well,
it's like there was this white dude who went on a march recently somewhere in the US, and his placard said, I was going to write a placard, but I decided that white men need to shut up for a while. And he was walking around with it. Such a strange thing, because he actually is making
It's
it.
meta.
It's
It's very
pretending
meta.
he's not making. But what you realise with a lot of this stuff, a lot of the white people, meaning, upper middle class white people who moan about cultural appropriation and so on and kind of self-flagellate for being white, it's really actually a new form of white pride. It looks like white shame. They're saying, oh, us goddamn white people, we do such bad things. But what they're really doing is advertising how woke they are, how racially aware they are, how special they are in comparison with the working class white rabble who don't understand these things. So it's really, it's almost like a new form of white nationalism. Basically, they're saying we're good white people. We're switched on. We understand history. We know you're not allowed to wear a sombrero. We know you're not allowed to dress as a Japanese girl. That's how good we are. So whenever I see white people attacking white people, I think you really are just showing off about how special you are. There's something very ugly about that.
You know, for you guys watching, please comment, and we'll be taking some of those. And also ask yourself this question: are you white enough to feel guilt? I think that's I think that's kind of the question that we're getting that we're getting to. Recently with the whole cultural appropriation thing, we got to the point where I think, what was it? Kendall Jenner came under attack for her hair, and if we can bring that up in Vogue, in Vogue, Kendall Jenner. I didn't know much about her. I knew that she was a model and she was a part of like the Kardashian Jenner family, and I saw this picture. And I felt so weird because I hadn't aside from my wife, I hadn't fallen in love in a while. And I was looking at it, I was like, oh my God, this is one of the most gorgeous things I've ever seen. She actually looked like an ex-girlfriend of mine, but like a model caliber. If my ex could have been a
You
model.
get all the punches in, huh?
This is mine. If I'm dressed like this, I'm gonna get this one in. And I was looking at this thing and I was kind of like, is there any chance that all the people who are mad at her are mad at her because she's just so gorgeous, and it's almost like a jealousy thing.
But also, the key thing with Kendall Jenner and her hair, it wasn't an Afro hairstyle. It was an Edwardian puffed up hair, which then later on gave rise to the big brushed back hairstyles of the 1960s and 70s. So it wasn't even an Afro hairstyle. But I thought. But what was most striking is that Vogue magazine made a statement. Vogue made a statement in which they said, this is not an Afro hairstyle, this is an Edwardian hairstyle, so you're all wrong. However, we apologise for any offence caused. And you just think to yourself, please stop apologising to people.
Right.
Apologies makes the permanently offended more and more powerful. I mean, they want apologies, they feed on them, it gives them life. So I think for Vogue and others who did not put her in an Afro hairstyle, and it would have been fine if they had, in my view, as a fashion look, but they didn't, and yet they still apologise. This is the level we've reached with the cultural appropriation hysteria, where you now have to apologise even when you haven't actually culturally appropriated.
Right.
something.
Well, they're saying, what's the saying now? It's intention doesn't matter, impact does.
Right.
That's the.
Yeah.
Is that the?
That's the thing. Yeah, because it's like it's not what you intended to do. It's like how did you make somebody feel? Like that's how you evaluate an action like that. And so for them, it's the same way with that poem that came out too.
Yeah.
Oh, in the nation,
The
right?
Nation,
So
right?
interesting.
Yeah, because it's like the intention I think was to sort of capture some of the of dissatisfaction, the pain that people go through in their lives. But some people took it the wrong way, and as a result, they were forced to apologize. And I think they also fired that person too, didn't they?
I'm not sure.
I think the editor got fired.
I don't remember the piece, but the editor got fired or
Yeah.
quit or something like
And they
that.
unpublished the
The poetry
poem,
editor?
which is
Yeah.
just Orwellian.
There you go, down memory hole.
Down the memory hole. But
Yeah.
it's but I have a real problem with you've just described exactly correctly what's happening, which is people's subjective interpretation now counts for so much. If they subjectively believe that you are offending them or that you are being racist or that you've done something bad, that counts for more than what you were objectively actually doing. And I have a real problem with that because that's just a license for everyone to go around feeling offended all the time and crushing the things that they think have offended them. I think one of the ways out of this current situation we found ourselves in is simply to refuse to give in to those demands and don't play the offended person's game. I do think people have to stand up for themselves and say, look, I have the right to wear a sombrero at a party. Or I have the right to wear a Japanese dress to my prom. Remember that prom girl who got a
Yeah,
huge
right,
amount of
Your
trouble?
culture is not my prom dress.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just so you guys know, this culture is not your prom. So I better not see you at prom wearing this. I'm going to a lot of proms
Oh,
this
my God,
year.
some poor
I better not see
17-year-old
anybody.
kid shows up in a
Big
bumblebee outfit.
July.
You know what's funny is that phrase, it reminds me of a phrase like my mom used to tell me growing up, which is the road to hell is paved in good intentions, except it's like the flip side of that, because if it's impact and not intent refers to the feelings and intentions of the person doing it. But then the impact here is also just somebody else's feelings. Like if the impact was like someone got physically hurt or like something actually happened, it'd be one thing. But both the intent here and the impact are up to subjective interpretation because we're not mind readers. So I don't know
Right.
what you meant when you did this thing, but I also don't really know what's going on with you when you say that this bothers you. And right, part of it is like eventually it's calling for somebody else to give you a consideration that you're not willing to give them. And that's all like fun and games, but eventually either you figure out like either a government or a society that forces everybody else to give you this benefit of the doubt and this courtesy that you're explicitly not willing to give people when you say something like your feelings don't matter, what matters is the feelings that got hurt. Well, it's like, no, either all our feelings matter or you're gonna have a war eventually. Like what do you want? You're not just gonna force people to care if they tell you to your face, I don't care. In the end, people in a free country don't have to care about your feelings.
Yeah, it's trying to create strict liability for emotions, essentially.
Right.
Yeah.
I do wonder how much of it is genuine too, because I've been guilty of hopping on like a tweet storm or something like that, or the Twitter bandwagon and going after somebody because it's like a pile on it. It's easy, and I don't have to move, and I can be dressed like a moron and do it. So I wonder how much of it is genuine, like. Genuine hysteria, and I am genuinely outraged, and how much of it is, this is something I can take part in.
I think sometimes, I think it can be both. I think sometimes it is genuine. I think it crosses the line from being a quite practiced display of offence simply because you want to destroy a particular person or you want to just show that you are very sensitive and aware. So it can be quite cynically done sometimes. But other times I think it does cross the line into quite a hysterical moment. Where you do, particularly on Twitter and online, where you have these huge storms of people that build up, and they rage and rage against someone for, something that's actually pretty innocent. I mean, I've experienced that myself. I wrote a piece for the Telegraph newspaper in Britain a few years ago on transgender issues, which I know are incredibly controversial, and had exactly that kind of response, petitions for the article to be unpublished and for me to be sacked and all these things. And I was looking through this stuff and it felt very real. It felt like people were losing control. And I think what that speaks to is a situation where if you live in a society which constantly tells people that they are psychically vulnerable, that they are weak, that words wound, this is the great phrase of our time, words wound as surely as a knife would wound you, what you do is you give rise to a vulnerable new generation in particular who genuinely do experience words as hurtful and do actually feel, if they see a photograph of Katy Perry dressed in a Japanese style, they feel wounded at some level. So I think the more that society socializes people into this culture of vulnerability and psychic weakness, the more that it is actually likely people will feel those feelings.
So that's a great segue, and Lenore, you can definitely come in on this. So there was an article recently in the Daily Mail about a study, and I don't know if we have it, we can put it up on the screen. 25% of college students at Arizona State University say they were traumatized by the 2016 election of Donald Trump, and that they're actually showing symptoms of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or I don't know what they call it, syndrome or something like that. And I think it's a fair question where it's sort of like, how did we get to this point where even something like an election or something like costumes and all that can cause people to, at least for them, to feel genuine trauma and all that. And Lenore, maybe you could.
Well, I'm just trying to flip through here. I collect. Like other people collect baseball cards, I collect Halloween tips and suggestions and warnings. And I'm looking through here trying to find the one that gives you advice on if Halloween is too much for your child, here's some things you could do. It says younger kids can be apprehensive about going door to door trick-or-treating. And if so, one of the things you can do for them is to give them a little sign that they hold up that says, I'm trick-or-treating, so they don't have to have the difficulty and the fear and the misery, the untenable misery of saying, trick or treat. And in doing that, I mean, okay, maybe some kids can't say, basically I think if you put that cauldron in somebody's face, they get what they're supposed to do. But you're already saying this is too much for you. The funnest thing on earth, trick or treat! Give me food for free just because I'm cute and young, because I'm dressed like never a bee. Dressed like a mug, something that nobody get offended. Somehow that is too much for kids. And this same article for how to help your kids through trick-or-treat says, plan ahead, trick-or-treat early, plan on going only to a few houses and then head home so you can stick with your nightly routine because, one night of, bacchanalia of getting all those Snickers and who knows if they'll ever come home again. And then there was another piece about it that says it can be, I'm trying to find, there was another thing that they said to do. Oh yeah, try on the costume beforehand and let your child get used to it and maybe go outside in it for like an hour so they can acclimate.
Is it like a new car? Like take it for a drive?
Yeah. It basically is. It's like, it's going to be unusual. It's a new situation. You're going to be out.
You might look in the mirror and actually think you've turned into this character.
Right, you look and then there's the things over the head and you start buzzing. So what this is just sort of the apotheosis of treating children as if they are all fragile, as if they can't handle talking to strangers, meeting strangers, doing something new, wearing a different outfit, going out at night, ruining their routine, eating candy. I mean, all of this has been written as too much for kids to handle. Is it a surprise that when everything has been mediated, honey, I'll do it. She wants to trick or treat. She would like a piece of candy. Thank you so much. She can't say thank you. But this means thank you, and this means no, I don't want candy. It's too much for me. If you've been brought up by people who've been told by the advice givers, by Parents Magazine, by the internet, not we the internet, the rest of the internet, that everything is too much for them to handle, I'm not surprised that they grow up not being able to handle things, A, because they've been told it's too much, and then B, because they don't get the experience. If you're not going door to door, ringing the bell of people you don't know, sometimes there's cobwebs on the door and there is a creaking door and you get the candy and you leave. I mean, if all that has been taken out of our kids' lives, and instead, everything is made easier and adult supervised and portion controlled, and we've checked the labels and we dunked it in milk and we made sure it was fine for you.
Dunked it in milk?
No, I made that up. I dunk all my candy
Watch,
in milk.
that's going to be an article.
Right.
Make sure.
Never dunk your candy in milk.
Yeah.
Or do dunk your candy
Well, I think
in milk.
whipped milk now is like a white supremacist.
Wait.
Yeah,
Speaking
yeah.
of, I got a milk thing here for you. You know, all the companies try to get
Well,
on this. Wait, I just have to say that one of the companies is saying, this Halloween, give kids, instead of candy, give them chocolate milk because it's filled with calcium.
Oh, well, I mean, that's what you want on Halloween.
Kind of
Yeah.
like that.
Especially if you're a skeleton. But I guess, like, how did we, get to that point? Because I don't know how old. Well, we're like the same. I'm 30. I'm 36, 33.
Yeah, I'm
33.
36.
We got
Looking great.
I'm 43.
I'm just not.
Talk about traumatizing. We have to tolerate it.
Go ahead, honey.
Reminded
Tell
that I'm
them
mortal
how old
every
you
day.
are, and then they could judge
There you
you.
go. Look at the camera. You need some candy.
But, I mean, it seems like a pretty new, phenomenon, and I'm
It
just
is
wondering
pretty new.
what are the reasons why, we've gotten to this point.
That is a great question. I feel like there's almost a sweepstakes to come up with something new that you can do that is more gentle and more kind, better for kids. And we've just been doing this since, I would say, since the 80s was the beginning of the real stranger danger. We'd always heard about stranger danger, but the 80s, they put the kids on the milk cartons. It says, have you seen me? There were milk cartons in the 80s, right?
I wasn't in America yet.
Yeah. You were missing.
He heard about them. Yeah.
Well, you heard that they had milk in America. I was.
We didn't have milk in Russia. So.
Milk had us. Awful reference. To
That is
Yakov's.
appropriation.
There we go. There we go.
I talked about Yakov Smirnoff on the first live stream. Is this going to be a thing? I hope that's not a running
Oh,
gag.
really?
Oh, I hope it's not a
This is
running
the
gag.
Yakov Smirnoff Hour,
Yeah.
brought to you by We the Internet. In any event, so you start getting scared for their physical safety, and you think that, they never mentioned on the milk cartons that, of course, the children who were missing, the vast majority were taken by parents in a custody battle, or they ran away, and almost every...
Well, that's the thing that always interests me, because you always hear about the stranger danger stuff, but
Right.
you are far more likely to be abused by someone in your household.
Oh,
or,
for sure. Like 90-something% is by people that you know. And yet, so actually, I think stranger danger, if I were a predator, I would say, think about stranger danger so nobody would notice me coming in and getting my niece or nephew, because it's really looking in the wrong direction when you start saying, worry about the people down the street. And I have to say, Halloween is like the test market for all of our obsessions and fears about kids. And on Halloween now, if you're not allowed to even turn on your light if you're on the sex offender registry, as if suddenly all the children who are ringing doorbells are being pulled in and raped. And actually, even sex crimes don't go up. No, crimes don't go up on Halloween, but even...
Wait, there was a lot going on there.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't want to get to this whole thing. All I want to say...
Turn off the lights.
Go back
Right.
to where you were defending sex offenders.
I'm defending
You're
the
saying
idea
they're not
that
even
kids
allowed
are
to
not...
turn the
Yeah,
light
in
on?
many places, or sometimes they have to go and all...
They get rounded up or something.
Definitely
They
not
do
about
get
mobs.
rounded up.
This is about children.
No, yeah,
Right.
Yeah, they lock
Not
them up.
mobs,
They
right.
they do lock-ins at the rec center. They take all the sex offenders.
Really?
Yeah, that's the thing.
Even post, like they've already served
Post
their...
everything. If they're on the list, they get rounded up and they get put in.
Is that legal?
In some states, yeah. It's a practice that they do to take them out of commission for the night.
I mean, I will say. I think it
But
depends.
actually, all I just want to say is, in terms of reality and statistical reality, this was studied. Do sex crimes go up on Halloween? Are children vulnerable to people who are on the sex offender registry? And there is no recorded instance of a trick-or-treater hurt by a person on the registry during Halloween. And the number of crimes and molestations and whatever don't go up. So it's just another manifestation of we have to be super worried about everything on Halloween, and it makes for great copy. We sort of conflate the idea of ghosts and goblins out with real things out to hurt our children, and actually the only danger to kids on Halloween, the real statistical danger, is getting hit by a car. So I say, let them go out, let them trick or treat, let them, in some states you're not even allowed to let certain, kids under a certain age have to be supervised, and kids over a certain age can't trick or treat.
I'm just imagining
So-
the worst thing that could possibly happen is you have like a sex offender clown car, and they're all piling, and then they hit a kid, and then people go
That would
crazy.
You thought about this.
Well, I gave that a lot of thought, and then it came out of my mouth, And then I'm wondering, I wish we could just put that away, what I just said.
All I want to say, so on Halloween, the danger is getting run over by a car. So put reflective stuff on the costume. It's as simple as that. But
I think, well, the work Lenore has done on this has been amazing. Just the generational shift that has occurred in how we treat children and how we raise children. I remember kids in Britain, we don't have the same attachment to Halloween as you guys do. It's not a huge holiday, but all those trends are still happening in the UK as well. Children don't go out anymore. They're not allowed out. When I was young, you weren't allowed in. We were not allowed in I had 5 brothers. There were 6 of us. During the school holidays, we were literally not allowed in the house. We were kicked out at 9 o'clock in the morning, and we came back for dinner or lunch at 2 or 3. The parents wanted you out because they had work to do. So the shift has been so dramatic. And there have been surveys in Britain which show that teenagers are now far less likely to have Saturday jobs, far less likely to spend time away from their parents, or the time they spend away from their parents has shrunk enormously. Far less, they start drinking and having sex at an older age than they used to in the past. So there has been, and now, of course, adolescence is being redefined upwards all the time, and there are even scientific surveys and studies which suggest that adolescence now continues to 24 and maybe even to 30. Wow. So I think there's been this really radical redefinition of childhood as a terrifying time in your life, a risky time in your life. And the problem with that, of course, is in the same way that kids have to roll around in dirt and eat things they shouldn't eat in order to develop immunity and in order to be able to withstand all the pressures of nature and disease and everything else. In the same way, they also need to get into arguments in the playground, have a fight, maybe get slapped across the face, meet a strange man on the street and then find a way to get away from him. They need to go through all those things.
I just couldn't.
In order to develop the social immunity, in order to start.
In America, that's called character, right?
There was near my school, where I went to school, there was this incredibly strange man who wore men's clothes down to here and then a skirt. And he was obviously mentally unwell, so I don't want to be too demeaning.
Was it a kilt?
No, it was a skirt, a pleated skirt, and then he had men's shoes on. So he was a very strange man, and he would just walk around our school, near our school. So everyone knew, don't go near this guy, he's very strange. He's probably okay, but just don't take a risk. So, kids negotiated that stuff for themselves, and that's how you develop the raw materials of adulthood, through experience, through learning how to cope. If you have a situation where children are cushioned and protected from every fight, from every argument, from saying trick or treat at their front door, they won't develop those adult skills. And that's going to store up so many problems for society in the future.
I have a question about it, because you said you were one of 6. I have 4 brothers growing up, so there were 5 of us. We grew up in a hive. So I grew up in like an apartment complex with a lot of other kids. So we were always going out. I wonder if the fact that people are having fewer kids now might have something to do with it, in that when you have a household of like 1 or 2, where it's sort of like you're keeping your eye on them.
Precious.
I don't actually think that. I don't think it's that they're more precious. I think it's the more resources thing. First of all, if you just have 2 kids, and if you have 2 parents, then you can actually have one parent doting on each kid almost, and because that has sort of become the norm, the idea that you're never supposed to allow your kids out of your sight. Well, if you have 5 kids, obviously that's not going to work. But I also think there's economics at work there, because especially if you have 2 parents working and 2 kids, you have a lot of extra money that people didn't have when there was maybe 1 parent working and 5 kids. And so then the marketplace comes in and says, you need after-school classes for all of them, and you need to get them the indoor jungle gym, and you need to sign them up for some special tutoring. So we get so used to the norm being that kids are always in supervised activities, because they've all sort of flooded in, because there's all these dollars out there. And there's also dollars to spend on unnecessary safety gadgets. So you have to scare the parents into thinking that they need to be GPSing their kids all the time, or that they need some kind of surveillance, and then you can sell it to the parents. I mean, there's baby knee pads now. There are
Baby knee pads?
There's baby knee pads.
Their knees are pads.
I know. There's thud guards for, like, you're actually, I think, wearing a thud guard for their heads. And there are spoons that change color if the food is too hot. I mean, all these things are sold to parents as absolutely necessary, when obviously they're absolutely not necessary, because we lived without them for the first million years of evolution. But if there's money to be made, you can scare a parent, then you get their dollars.
Is part of it, though, like the expectation of safety? Like, because the world has gotten safer.
Right, yeah,
So
we
it
just
feels
don't
like
seem
if
to-
something
yeah.
bad happens, it's more
your fault,
extraordinary.
and it's also your fault.
Right, like I'm
Yeah.
one of two, but like my grandparents had a ton of siblings, but it was like I didn't know half of them, because it's like this one died in the war, this happened.
Right.
My grandpa died from drinking horse milk in Uzbekistan. That's a fun story. But it was like all these weird.
That's the way I want
The
to
milk
go.
did get
I'm just
you.
gonna drop that one in and
Right,
not
right.
elaborate. But like, there's correct. You've done the research on this, but to me
Yeah.
it feels like the world is safer.
The
So
world
now
is
it's
so
like,
much safer.
but now everyone's expectation is for everything to be safe
Exactly.
and
You know,
controlled.
anything bad that happens, it's, there's somebody to blame. I mean, also you look at the litigious culture, and that's what litigation
Right,
is
yeah.
there's always somebody you can point to. And so what did I just do? I was just talking to a guy from Canada who works on his school, the school district safety committee, and one kid had been dunking a basketball, and his finger got caught in the net, and he broke his finger. And what did they do?
Sued whoever owns the property.
I don't know if they sued or if this was done, I hate to use the word prophylactically, but the word, the fact is they got rid of all the nets on all the baskets in the district.
Well, for one, I mean, this kid could dunk. That's very good. That's amazing.
Yeah. So there is this expectation that nothing bad should ever happen to anyone, and the more control that there is, I mean, the fact that most of our kids will make it to adulthood these days, with infant mortality, so thank God, low. Then it starts seeming like, well, you had all the equipment. You could have been watching them. You could have been GPSing them. You could have been with them. You could have been driving them. Why did this kid have anything happen to him? You weren't paying enough attention. So it's never fate or God or bad luck. It's always bad parenting is what we blame now. And if you're worried about being the person to blame for something terrible happening to your kid, you can't let them out of your sight, and you can't let them trick or treat. And in fact, in all these towns around America, they do trunk or treat now. Do you know about trunk or treat?
No.
You know about trunk or treat? Do you? No.
Trunk or treat.
Soon enough it'll come to your country. So it's the community center, church, synagogue, whatever, takes the parking lot.
Not the community center with the sex offenders.
Two different communities.
Very different
We got the
community.
calendars mixed up. Oh boy.
Oh man, double booking. Oh, this is a nightmare or a dream, depending on which
Wait,
side
so
you're
trunk
on.
or treat?
It's the parking lot of City Hall.
Okay.
Okay, we'll just go there. So all the cars make a circle, and they're trunk side in, and then they open up their trunks, and inside is candy. And actually, if you ask me, telling kids to get used to going to people's cars, there's candy in the trunk. Come on. But nonetheless,
As long
Why
as,
those guys use that trick?
as long as it's a hybrid. Right, that's it.
There you
Then it's
go.
okay.
Right,
then
right,
you can
there
go
you
to the
go.
car. You can trust a Prius.
you can always trust Prius. So then they go from car to car, getting their candy, and the trunk or treat is generally advertised as a safe alternative to Halloween, and that gets us back to my first point, which is that Halloween is not unsafe. Right? We've just written it as unsafe in our minds because there's so many warnings about they're going to get sick from the food, and they're going to have trouble saying hello, and they're going to trip over their costume, and they're going to get an allergic reaction to the makeup, and they're not going to be able to see the car coming because they're wearing a mask. So once you've made Halloween into this just, orgy of disasters that could befall your kid, then you think you have to take them to the trunk or treat. And the people who have come up with this idea or propagate it are saying, well, it's the same thing. They still get candy, but it's not the same thing. It's not the same thing. You haven't had the excitement of going out at night, and you haven't had the frisson of, pressing that doorbell and saying trick or treat. You haven't gotten a chance to get to know your neighborhood and be brave with your friends going
So how
around.
do the kids cope? Does anyone here ever say trick?
It doesn't
Do
come
they
up-
actually trick or?
Well,
like,
I think it's an implied threat.
Yeah.
'Cause you say trick or treat, so it's either you give me a treat or I'm.
but
you know.
nobody thinks it's an implied threat.
Yeah.
But
exactly.
because in Britain it's far rarer. Halloween is a much smaller holiday,
Yeah.
so some people do not have candy ready, so they shut the door, and then there is the trick element, which usually
yeah.
involves
Yeah.
throwing
Paper
eggs.
towel, throw eggs.
Eggs at the
We
window.
smashed
That
his
happens.
pumpkin once when I was a kid. He got real mad. And once we blew up a mailbox.
But see, the thing is, if we assume,
Russia.
if we assume,
I was like 11, so.
It's fictional.
Yeah, we didn't think it would work, but it worked. It was like ping pong balls and hairspray and some other stuff, and it worked.
I was just thinking, like, growing up, like my mother, when she was pregnant with me and all my brothers, she drank Budweiser and smoked Marlboros. And
I think it's crazy that Queen Bee could buy cigarettes.
right, she could get out of the house.
Yeah.
And I'm just imagining, like, I could
Budweiser.
definitely use that to blame a lot of the problems that I have.
Go ahead.
But also, I think a lot of my eccentricities, a lot of my interesting stuff. It's like, oh, cool, that's an interesting
the
story.
antenna.
Well, you know how this relates back to the way it got brought up is I think all this kind of stuff, and again, this is I think, so feel free if there's research that.
I got the research. It's here.
But it feels like it's teaching kids that they can't trust their own intuition and analysis with this stuff.
They're not going to have any intuition because they've been told that everything is dangerous. Can I give you my favorite story of this?
Please.
Okay, so there's a grandma who writes to me. She was in the allergist's office, and she's doing a crossword puzzle, and she's so old she's using a magnifying glass. And this little 3-year-old walks over from the other couch in the office, and so she starts showing, well, this is how you use the magnifying glass. See, it makes it bigger. And the mother snatches the kid away and says, he has to learn now not to trust strangers. And it's so disheartening.
that's depressing.
It's so depressing, but what the kid is learning is literally everything is out to get
Yeah.
you and out to kill you. And, whether it's the candy or the candy giver or the lady in the allergist's office, they're all the same. They're all going to hurt you in some way. And the only person who can save you is your parent. And that's why we scream at parents who let their kids wait in the car for a few minutes or who let their kids walk home. Why weren't you with them? Anything could happen. In this hysterical moment when we really think that any child unsupervised is automatically in danger, then we're really mad at the parent for putting him in danger when actually all they've done is allowed them a little
That's right.
independence.
And then we're shocked when these kids get to university at the age of 18 and can't cope with everyday life. I mean, it makes perfect sense that they can't cope because they've never trained
Developed
for that.
Right. I mean, the word that is used these days is anti-fragility, which is the same thing you were talking about, where if you're exposed to dirt, then you get this, robust immune system. And similarly, you're exposed to something that's a little scary, a little confusing, frustrating, and there isn't somebody there to help you. You have to develop all those skills.
Yeah.
Parents Magazine did an article a couple of years ago, but it's my whipping boy, so I'm going straight to it, where it was like a Q&A. Your child is old enough to stay home alone for a short while you run an errand, but now she has a friend over for a play date. Are you still allowed to go to the dry cleaner and rush back home? And Parents Magazine said, oh, no. No, you want to be there to step in case there's a spat.
It's not even like just in case the house burns down.
No.
It's
They
just-
did do that, too.
It's in case there's an interpersonal issue.
Well, both. They said, what if there's something goes physically wrong? And they talked about some kid who had once gotten burned by microwave macaroni because there's the physical harm. But then they were also saying the emotional harm.
The emotional burn. That's
the emotional
one.
burn.
That's that one.
Right. The flaming macaroni in your brain.
With that, because I know Jonathan Haidt has talked about this about the level of depression among college students too, where they aren't able to handle this. And when I hear about that, it definitely changes the way that I look at the way that they're responding to these things. Where it's like, ooh, at least I have a little bit of an idea of where they're coming from. But I wonder, how do you then change things so that they are capable of doing that? Because one thing, it's so easy to just say, oh, snowflakes and all that.
And you can get down on the quote-unquote helicopter parents when even if you don't want a helicopter, you leave your kid in the car
You could be
and
arrested.
somebody screams at you. So
So like what what
I
can,
have an answer.
What can you do?
Call on me,
Does anybody
Mr.
here
P.
know? Does anybody here know? Please,
I
please,
speak your
Lenore.
language. Right. So Let Grow has two things that we're doing in schools. One is the Let Grow project, where teachers tell the kids to go home and they have to do, with their homework, one thing on their own. Run an errand, make dinner, walk to a friend's house, get yourself to the bus. And because everyone else is doing it and because you're forced to do it by the school, the parents who they don't know where the milestones are anymore. They don't know what age you can let your kid play outside or trick or treat. But everybody's doing it, so they let their kids do it. And then the kids start comparing notes. I went to the store. Oh, I went and got a Slurpee. And then it becomes normal again. And the people who are the most excited by it are parents, because they're so proud when their kid comes home and they've done something on their own. So that sort of breaks the ice. And the other thing is keeping the schools open for free play after school. So you have all these kids, all different ages, coming up with a game, arguing about it, changing the rules. That's democracy. And they're off their devices. So they're just playing like we used to do, I don't know with the horses in Uzbekistan, but the rest of us here in our country used to play on the streets.
You play with horse, then you drink horse milk, then you die from horse milk.
Right.
That was the game.
It was a famine. They drank horse. It was normal there, I think. They just didn't pasteurize it, which is where bacterial infections come in.
Yeah. Oh, well, we're going to dedicate this to the memory of
Grandpa.
I was just imagining like a 24-year-old grad student where it's like, I walked to the bus by myself and got a Slurpee, like getting it to that.
But it's true, but on some British campuses, there have been reports of 18-year-olds who arrived not being able to do some pretty basic things, like wash their clothes and so on, because they've never done it.
Wash their clothes. I hadn't done washing my clothes.
But other things as well. But I think
You're a
what
bug.
Lenore's doing, I think that's the age at which it needs to be done, because I think by the age of 18 or 19 or 20, it's not too late. You can always shake people out of things, but it's much more difficult. I did a speech at Oxford University a few months ago. There was a protest against me, as there tends to be, and the 18 and 19-year-olds who were protesting, there was a look in their eye which made me think, oh no, you've gone to the other side. I can't get you back. There was a real. They had placards saying your words wound me. Your speech is hate speech. We don't want you here. And there was a look in their faces which said to me that they genuinely believed that my being on the campus to do a half-hour speech about freedom of speech and heresy and the history of heresy would damage them. Even though they weren't coming to the speech, there was no obligation on them to do so.
Bad news.
Yeah.
Too late.
So I tried to engage with them and I tried to talk to them. I went out to the protest and they were like, oh my God. And I wanted to have a conversation and I want to say, come inside and listen to and they weren't having it. So it gets fixed, I think, at a particular time. It's not unfixable, but I think getting in there early, in childhood, encouraging robustness, encouraging experimentation, encouraging arguing and
I
even
grew up
fighting,
arguing
I
with my
think.
family all the time,
Yeah.
and it was like the type of thing where sometimes my friends would come over that weren't used to that, and would be like, "What's going?" And I'm like, "Oh no, this is like we love each other. This is like how we do." And I argue like politics and whatever with my
It's a good
family
skill
all
to
the
develop,
time,
arguing.
and the reason we can get so heated is because we know that like this bond's not going to be affected by it. We can just go nuts and like
Be honest with each other.
yeah, and also because we care about each other. Because like if I pass a random stranger on the street that says something like offensive to me or like even like racist or something, hates me for like whatever being a Jew or something, like I don't care. That's a stranger.
I didn't know you were.
Uh-oh, should I go?
Goodness.
I didn't know this way about Jews.
Everyone feels that way.
But like whatever it is, it's somebody close to me who I'm gonna want to argue it out with, versus a stranger. Like what the hell do I care? I'll move on with my life. Let them move on with their life as long as they don't have any ability to like actually do something to me. But like otherwise, it's out of respect when I like somebody that they say something and I'm like, oh, let's figure this out. And like only when like I've had times in my life where somebody like said a couple things and I was like, oh, I'm just gonna keep quiet here because like this person is not interested in like
I think
changing their worldview.
I think that's a good way to segue into the other topic that I wanted to talk about, where you have a situation where you're going from parents being overly protective because of the coddling.
But once again, we're not going to blame parents
Oh, no,
because
no.
they're stuck in this
Yeah,
culture that's told them
Well,
that everything is going to kill their kids.
So it's like
Right?
parents being affected by the culture, and
Yeah.
then when we go outside of that, where you actually have the state coming down and saying and trying to protect people's feelings and all that, and you can see that happen. Spiked has a really great documentary called "The Curious Case of the Nazi Pug." And you guys can go watch it. It's about a 20-minute documentary, and it's about this YouTuber, Count Dankula, who,
Sounds like a very serious.
Of course,
Very.
of the Hungarian House of Dankula. Of course.
and a while back, he taught his girlfriend's pug to give the Nazi salute.
Yeah.
Well, the pug
different
didn't.
from
yeah.
a shake.
Exactly.
gotta watch
I don't think the pug.
Because he did it in response to Zigai.
It was in response to
I don't know.
Gas the
in
Jews,
defense
actually.
of the dog, it was not. The dog did not know that it was a Nazi salute.
But Bernie, can you talk a little bit about that case, and then also, I mean, you spend your time between the U.S. and Europe, and just what's going on there as far as that case and hate speech in general.
We don't have freedom of speech in Britain, which is a real shame because it's one of the birthplaces of the idea of freedom of speech, going back to the Levellers in the English Civil War, John Milton, John Stuart Mill, all these great warriors for freedom of speech, and now we've just abandoned it. The Nazi Pug story is, on one level, hilarious and ridiculous. This guy, as you say, he was a YouTuber. He had like 8 followers. No one was following this guy. Now he has hundreds of thousands because he taught his girlfriend's pug to do a Nazi salute because he wanted to irritate his girlfriend, and he thought, what's the worst thing you could do to a cute dog? Turn it into a Nazi. So he put this on YouTube. No one complained about it, literally no one. The police in Scotland caught wind of it. They heard about it, and they went out looking for people who would feel offended. So they went to Jewish groups and so on, and they eventually found someone who felt offended. He was arrested under our Communications Act, Section 27, which says you cannot be grossly offensive online. We have a law against gross offensiveness.
How do they define that?
Well, it's entirely subjective, it turns out. And he was taken to court, and he was found guilty of being grossly offensive. He was spared a prison sentence. I think if he'd been sent to jail, it would have been a serious problem for Britain. But he was fined £800, which he's refusing to pay on principle, which I think is
he will
quite
go
right.
to jail.
So he might still go to jail. He's not going to pay the fine, that's for sure. So it's ridiculous, but it's also quite terrifying, because what it means is in Britain in 2018 you can be arrested for things you say. And it's not just him. A young woman was recently also found guilty of being grossly offensive because she quoted gangster rap lyrics on her Instagram page, which included the M-word, and a black police officer said she was offended by those words. We've had people arrested for denying the Holocaust and being found guilty again of being grossly offensive.
Yeah, we just have to make clear, Count Dankula does not.
No,
deny
no,
the Holocaust.
his
dog might.
His whole bit is dependent upon.
But he's actually trying to get 6 million YouTube followers.
It's funny because there's been a Nazi dog before, in fact, and it's talked about in the documentary.
Lassie.
In Nazi Germany, a man loved Hitler so much that he taught his dog to do the Nazi salute. So it's actually happened in history, and the Nazis thought it was very offensive for a dog to do a Nazi salute. They thought that was demeaning to Hitler, but they didn't take it any further. They thought, okay, that's fine. So Scotland is more het up than Nazi Germany.
Even
Nazi. But so we have public order legislation, we have communications legislation, we have hate speech legislation, and we have this across Europe. In fact, virtually every country has hate speech laws, which have meant, for example, that Brigitte Bardot, the actress turned animal rights campaigner, has been fined in France for insulting Islam. People have been arrested in Sweden. A Christian pastor in Sweden was given a 1-month suspended prison sentence for describing homosexuality as a tumour on society, which is a pretty ugly point of view, but that's his point of view. There have been numerous cases across Europe where people have been actually arrested for expressing their religious or political or stupid
also,
point of view.
I think something to point out too. Like these examples are what might be described as far right perspectives, but people on the left have been screwed over royally by these same laws. And Glenn Greenwald, writing for The Intercept, has a great article where he basically lists how far left groups or just left groups have been arrested or fined under these same ordinances.
That's
so,
right.
so if you think that these laws are somehow going to protect you from the far right, no, ultimately they will be used against you at
It's
some point.
really, and if you look at the history of hate speech legislation in Europe, and especially hate speech treaties, which are these treaties which bind numerous countries to outlawing racist speech and Nazi speech and so on, the history is absolutely fascinating, because in the post-war period, immediately after the Second World War, the Soviet Union in particular wanted an international treaty outlawing Nazi speech and far-right speech. And the West generally held out against that, particularly the United States, of course, which doesn't adopt any of these treaties because you guys have the First Amendment. But even Western Europe, Britain, France, Western Germany as it was then, held out against these demands by the Soviet Union that we have to have an international treaty outlawing these forms of speech. And they did that for decades, and the Soviet Union kept pushing because it was a very authoritarian state. But at some point, you know, around the late 1960s in particular, then through the 70s and into the 80s, Western Europe and started to adopt these treaties and these laws. And so our first law in Britain, which explicitly punished not simply racist violence, but racist speech, was in the late 1960s. And out of that have grown all these other laws which clamp down on certain forms of speech. So it's really terrifying. And what that means, I think, people say, oh, we still have freedom of speech, you just can't say something in favour of Hitler, or you just can't deny. But that means you don't have freedom of speech, because unless you can say absolutely anything you want, then what you actually have is licensed speech, where you may speak so long as you don't say something that the state thinks you shouldn't say. So in Britain, I am under license, in essence, when I'm writing or speaking. I wouldn't actually say any of these things, but all of us are under license. We are free to say certain things, and if we say something else, we could be arrested. That's a pretty serious situation.
That's scary. I once heard it explained like you can't say I'm all for freedom of speech except.
Yeah.
And once you have the asterisk, then
Right, or but, yeah.
It's
yeah.
over.
It's ironic because I think people that are in support of that sort of stuff see it as protecting the less powerful, but then whoever is making, implementing, backing up those laws is by definition going to be the more powerful.
Yeah.
And so in the end, it's just going to hurt the less powerful because there's some assumption there that people are going to give up their power by virtue of speech, but you're just letting the bad stuff stay in the shadows and grow there, while those in power are just going to use these things and manipulate them for their own benefit.
Absolutely right. I think one of the worst arguments for censorship these days is that freedom of speech is damaging for minority groups because they'll hear racist things or they'll hear misogynistic things. It's this incredibly paternalistic idea that they need to be protected. And I always go back to Frederick Douglass, the escaped slave, one of my American heroes, who wrote a great piece called A Plea for Free Speech, which you can find online. It's very short. He wrote it after he was having an anti-slavery meeting in Boston, I think, and it was invaded by pro-slavery people who shut it down. And he wrote this plea for free speech where he has this brilliant paragraph where he says, slavery could not have survived if we had had freedom of speech in the South, because we could have used it to organize politically, to make our case, to sell pamphlets on street corners, to get together and fight against this evil. So he says freedom of speech is the building block of all freedoms. Because if you don't have the ability to stand up for yourself and to articulate yourself and to make your demands, then really you have nothing. So I think you're absolutely right. It's often presented as a way of helping the powerless. But of course it just benefits the state and powerful institutions, and it means that minority groups in particular are encouraged to see freedom of speech as a dangerous thing.
Yeah, and the states, I think, we're very, fortunate, dare I say, a little spoiled with having the First Amendment. One of the things that I loved when I've spoken to you in the past is how you've described that because in England you don't have that First Amendment, you constantly have to remind the culture why it's so important for these speech protections. And something that over the past few years, I'm really not worried about state censorship or the state coming down on me when it comes to speech. What I'm more worried about are my neighbors, people using really like people using
people
things
with candy.
and sort of like kind of tying everything together, people using charges of cultural appropriation. You need to shut up, or saying things such as hate speech. You need to shut up. And because the internet, all the stuff that we do lives on the internet, on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, where you guys are watching this right now. It's really difficult to be an American producing comedy and producing all this stuff on these platforms that are now adopting a more European idea of what protected speech is.
Yeah, it's the tyranny of custom. In On Liberty by John Stuart Mill, which I think is the greatest thing ever written about freedom of speech, he makes the point that state censorship or legal censorship is often not the worst kind. The worst kind is a culture of conformism, which might be informal, it's not enforced by the state, but it can be so stifling that you end up censoring yourself. And he refers to it as the tyranny of custom. So it kind of bears down on you in a very real way, and you think, oh, maybe I shouldn't say that thing, maybe I shouldn't push that idea, maybe I shouldn't argue too hard against the idea of cultural appropriation because I know I'll get a Twitter storm. So I think that's the period we're living through now. I think, of course, in Britain and Europe, we still have state censorship. But probably worse than that, and probably more effective than that, is the new informal forms of censorship, cultural,
Well,
and that pressure to say the right thing.
Is in Russia, I mean, when I was a little kid, I remember, in school we would have Grandfather Lenin on the wall. You couldn't speak poorly about any of that stuff. And the state having censorship was really a means to an end to the people censoring themselves. Like, once it was established enough, there was a fear of the state, but it was equally a fear of your neighbors. Everybody was taught to distrust, and people would openly, feel a particular way and not trust people very close to them to just even be able to speak about it in the open. That's where the dystopian came in, because everybody kind of knew the reality. They knew that when they went to the store that there was a shortage of certain goods and that things weren't right. But out loud it was, this is great. Just even expressing suffering was kind of looked down upon.
Yeah, and I'll tell you guys about just a short example of something that we've experienced on Facebook. And we made a video about it called "Are You Guilty of Hate Speech?" And obviously we put out satire and whatnot. And a while back we put out a poll that said who's to blame for Hurricane Florence. We had two choices, and the first choice was Donald Trump, and the second choice was the gays. And that's
that was based on the Jerry Falwell, those statements from Hurricane Katrina.
Exactly.
Back in the day.
So how that joke thing came about was there was an article in the Washington Post saying that Donald Trump is complicit in hurricanes, and it made us think of people like Jerry Falwell.
Are we all technically?
Where was that butterfly? Huh? You can talk to him.
Exactly. And it made us think about pastors and all that who blame the weather on gay people, and we brought those two together, and we thought, oh, this is a funny way to look at it, and that was flagged as being against the community standards of hate speech. And this was the first time that I was I was personally affected by this stuff, and I thought, oh, it's obviously satire. I'm good. I'm good to go. And it's a little scary when the idea being, wait a minute, when even a comedic post could be flagged or taken down, then what else is left?
And so what we have now is corporate censorship. We have these vast Silicon Valley corporations who basically now facilitate public debate. I mean, they're so central. Facebook and Twitter in particular are so central to your ability to express yourself and be heard. So when they enforce these kind of rules, that impacts actually on freedom of speech. So I think the real problem in the US is that you guys have, the First Amendment I think is a great idea, but it only forbids the government from censoring people. It doesn't forbid private companies or anyone else. There was a really interesting Supreme Court case in the late 1940s, I think, where there was a private town, those towns which are actually company town.
Yeah.
And some Jehovah's Witnesses were working and living in this company town, and they wanted to distribute their religious stuff, and the company said, you can't, and we're allowed to tell you that you can't because this is a private area owned by a company. And the Supreme Court disagreed with them and said when private companies play a really big role in public space, they have to follow the same rules of freedom of speech. And I would actually like something similar being said to Facebook and Twitter, because they are now so central to the public square.
We actually got a question from Elliot who said, should the First Amendment be applied to social media in the U.S.? And then also he said, in much of Western Europe, should blasphemy laws be undone? I think we talked a little bit about.
Well, I know that Ireland right now is they're preparing to
They're voting today
to amend their constitution.
They're voting today on in the Irish constitution. There is a law against blasphemy, and they're voting in a referendum because to change the referendum, to change the constitution in Ireland, you have to have a referendum. So they're voting today. I expect it will be abolished.
Yeah.
Ireland is becoming a pretty liberal place. But the irony, of course, is that in Britain we abolished our blasphemy laws in 2008. In other European countries, they've all... Yeah, it took a while. Exactly. The last time it was used was in...
Well, blasphemy just isn't as cool.
Yeah.
In 1977 was the last time the blasphemy laws in Britain were used against a poet who wrote a poem describing a Roman centurion having sex with Jesus Christ. And he was found guilty and fined a huge amount of money. So that was the last time it was used. It was abolished in 2008. Blasphemy laws have been abolished across Europe. However, they're kind of coming in by the back door. So we have this new case in Austria where a woman was found guilty of hate speech in Austria for calling Muhammad a paedophile. And this week, she went to the European Court of Human Rights saying, can you please defend my freedom to say this thing? And the European Court of Human Rights decided that she was not allowed to say it and has decreed across the whole of Europe that it is impermissible to use that word to describe Muhammad. So to my mind, now that's not necessarily a word I would use to describe Muhammad. That's not necessarily something I'm interested in saying. But if you have these laws and these rules creeping back in, that's a new form of blasphemy law, but it's justified now in terms of stopping hate speech. So those medieval laws are kind of making a comeback.
Where did she say it? Do you know?
She said it I think she was giving a speech. I think she said it in a talk.
Yeah.
And it was judged to be inciting racial hatred.
And we probably don't have enough time to really get into the debate on whether or not social media should be regulated and all that. But something that I notice on a lot of our videos anytime this subject matter comes up, for example, we had a meme that went out not too long ago where it was Alex Jones on the guillotine, and in the crowd there was a man talking to his son saying, "Hey, don't worry, son, that'll never be us." And then shortly after that, there were I think hundreds of pages were taken off of Facebook, right. And the response that I kept seeing was, "They're a private company; they can do whatever they want, man. Shut up. Private company, do whatever they want." And it's like, I want people to understand that there's another way of looking at this where, yeah, I can respect the property rights, the private property rights of a corporation, of a company, but I can still be critical about what they choose to do with their property and all that. And I feel like that there's too much of a sort of like a black and white thing, like, oh, shut up, or the ones I love are the people like, well, why don't you go make your own platform?
Make your own Facebook.
Yeah, make your own Facebook. And it's like...
But it's bizarre, because what you have are these usually left-wing types calling for vast, unaccountable corporations to decide what it is permissible to say on the internet. You think, how did we get into that situation? You're basically calling on capitalists to punish people for saying things they disagree with.
It's
such
very
a perverse situation.
Well, because there has been a lot of criticism of Facebook and of social networking sites in general for their algorithms. And there have been businesses that have complained about how they were sort of like taken out, essentially, because the video algorithm changed, and as a result, people lost their revenue streams and everything else. So those are the same people that come around and say, but they have complete control over like the content that gets put on, and you shouldn't be upset if they strike you down.
I mean, this is the same the real life offline allegory here is like. People talk about incidents of racism in the NYPD, and then those same people are like, we need laws against manspreading or Broadway Showtime dancers on the train or whatever. And it's like, well, you're talking about a situation that's interpersonal that you want cops to step in on, the same cops that you just described as having racial biases. Like, which is it? Like, my opinion is kind of online the same thing, is that I would rather handle as much as I can handle on my own without having any kind of authorities like that step in. And same thing with online. I know can't just build your own Facebook. But in the long run, you had a lot of large corporations that were on, AOL was a Goliath at one point. People might have said you can't just build your own AOL, but eventually Google came in, eventually Facebook came in, eventually somebody else will come in. So I think there's always going to be short-term pains, but the question is like, what kind of short-term pains are we willing to tolerate for bigger problems in the long run?
And just, in terms of bringing it back down to, is social media, should that be considered a public resource? I mean, I don't know. I think that's certainly as we get further into this, like courts might rule and say that there are certain elements that the internet has become so integral to one's life and existence and expression that it might eventually have some First Amendment protection. At some point. But like I said, we're very early with the internet at this point, and who's to say? So keep an eye out for that.
Yeah, and if any of you out there are actually building your own AOL or your own Facebook, well, let us know, because we would love to continue to have these conversations. We're going to wrap it up. So I'm just wondering, final words, any Halloween tips, or just life tips in general that we can give? Boris, I'll start.
No tips. Just a reflection that, like, honestly, I used to love Halloween as a little kid, and honestly, even up until college, maybe a little after college, I used to always dress up. I would be the guy to wear like some crazy shit to high school, and it's like I've gotten too busy, and like now like Halloween is happening this weekend. I have no idea what my costume is, and I honestly find it upsetting. I used to really enjoy thinking of like clever, goofy stuff. And I wish I had more time to like think of.
My God, think about it this afternoon.
Well, if anybody has any suggestions for what you would love to see Boris do, he will not shave his beard. So don't even start with that. That's a non-starter. But anything, just let us know in the comments. And Lenore, any?
I'd say if you remember having a great time as a kid on Halloween, give your kids that same opportunity. It's not a dangerous night. Put them in some reflective clothes and send them out with some friends. After dark.
Cool. Alex?
Don't hand out dental floss to kids. Just give them candy. What's wrong with you? That's it.
That's a really personal.
I thought about this.
I just think kick your kids out of the house. Just kick them out of the house. Don't let them come back for 2 or 3 hours. Like a childish version of The Purge. Just send the children out into the world, let them do whatever the hell they want, and in the long term, they'll benefit so much from that kind of behavior.
Cool. Well, once again, I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank Boris, Lenore, Alex, Brendan. Please support all of these guys online and everything that they're doing. And let us know what you think of the show. And if there's, I don't know, if you have an idea of a subject matter of another live stream that you'd like to see, or something you'd like to see me wear, just let me know.
This starts Lou's descend into becoming a cam girl.
Hey. This is so uncomfortable. Thank you guys so much, and we hope to see you on the next live stream. Please like, share, subscribe. Check us out on all the platforms. We do memes on Instagram. I talk to people on Facebook. And thank you so much. I need attention. Hey guys, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. Make sure you click the little bell to turn on notifications so you never miss a video. And if you really like the video, you can even support We the Internet TV on Patreon. Check out the link in the description below.